Let's review some key takeaways from this week's readings and videos related to the history of Native Americans in a period of warfare between the American Revolution and the War of 1812. Specifically, we're interested in the Northwest Indian War and Tecumseh's Rebellion, as well as Native American activities during the War of 1812. As we work through this module, consider the ways that these wars affected Native American cultures. The 1783 Treaty of Paris gave a great deal of western land to the United States without consulting Native Americans who actually lived there. Once again, the future for Native Americans was determined by whites without Native approval or consent. A major piece of legislation, perhaps the most important act passed by the Congress under the old Articles of Confederation, was the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which provided the terms by which settlement of the Old Northwest would occur. This included the future states of Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin, plus parts of present-day Minnesota. The U.S. began a policy it called expansion with honor. Under this policy, Native American land had to be acquired through formal treaties, which on one hand sounds fair, but there are many problems with this policy. For example, who is representing Native interests in negotiations? What about land traditionally used for hunting that isn't necessarily occupied year-round? How could the U.S., here's another problem, know that good faith was being used by negotiators, or that accurate translations of the terms of the agreement were provided to Native signatories? And how could the U.S. know that lands it purchased were sold by people who actually had the right to sell those lands? Ohio Valley Indian nations formed what became known as the Northwest Confederacy. They wanted the Ohio River as the boundary between the U.S. and Native American lands. Treaties under this confederacy could only be signed by the entire group, not by individual tribes. During this time, the British encouraged Native American resistance. In particular, they sold weapons and ammunition to tribes, and some agents, British agents, made promises of future help for Indians, promises they really didn't have the authority to make. Treaty disputes and near continual raids on both American and Indian settlements eventually sparked what became known as the Northwest Indian War from 1785 to 1795. The Northwest Indian War was a lengthy period of conflict that varied between full-scale military engagements and much lower-level violent conflicts, more like neighborhood disputes. The U.S. Army during this war was utterly embarrassed after Little Turtle and the Confederacy defeated both General Harmar and General St. Clair, if you recall from the readings. In response, the U.S. trained a special force, what became known as the Legion of the United States, commanded by Mad Anthony Wayne. Unlike military endeavors in the more recent past, even the Revolutionary War, this was a full-time professional army, not a collection of militias. Confederacy Chief Blue Jacket was defeated by Anthony Wayne at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, just southwest of present-day Toledo. The Treaty of Greenville ended the war, giving most of the Ohio Valley to the United States. And the U.S. continued taking land through other treaties, plus what was known as the factory system. Under this system, Indians bought or traded goods from American agents who charged high rates of interest on any credit purchases. And Native Americans became slowly entangled in a cycle of debt to American merchants, almost like a form of financial slavery. I would make a witty comparison about present-day students and their student loans, but I think my audience would not find this especially amusing. We jump ahead about 20 years to discuss a pair of Shawnee leaders who recognized the growing threat of the United States to their way of life. Tenskwatawa was a Shawnee spiritual leader known as the Prophet, He encouraged Native Americans to reject white influences, particularly alcohol, and he sought to restore and then maintain Indian culture and traditions. His brother was Tecumseh, a skilled military leader who pushed for an alliance of Native American tribes and nations. He wanted the creation of an independent Indian nation in the Old Northwest. The two brothers established Prophetstown as a center of Indian resistance. This is located in, or was located in, what is now present-day Indiana. They quickly began attracting hundreds of followers with their messages of spiritual rebirth, along with strong opposition to white settlement. William Henry Harrison negotiated the Treaty of Fort Wayne, a treaty that brought white settlers very close to Prophetstown. Tecumseh protested the treaty, to which he had not been invited, despite the fact that his land, the land that Prophetstown was founded on, was involved. He tried unsuccessfully to reach a compromise with Harrison. While Tecumseh was away recruiting more allies, Harrison's forces defeated Tenskwatawa and burned Prophetstown after the Battle of Tippecanoe. Tecumseh, though, continued working to build an alliance of tribes and nations opposed to white settlement. Unrest by native peoples in the Old Northwest contributed to the outbreak of the War of 1812, among other factors. During this war, Tecumseh allied with the British. He hoped they would support an independent Indian state. He helped the British win early victories, including the capture of Fort Detroit. However, the British were defeated in the Battle of Lake Erie, after which supply lines to the British and native forces with which they were allied were cut off. And the Americans then controlled the important waterways that were and are the Great Lakes. The British abandoned Tecumseh and his allies when confronted with U.S. forces led by Harrison. Tecumseh refused to surrender and was killed during the Battle of the Thames in southern Ontario, present-day southern Ontario. His death marked the end of unified native resistance to white settlement, although, of course, while not unified, Native American resistance to white settlement will continue for the next 2 centuries moving forward. The Creek Civil War was part of the War of 1812. The so-called Red Stick Creeks resisted efforts by other Creek bands to adopt white lifestyles and farming practices. The Red Stick Creeks, who allied with the British, attacked Fort Mims, killing white settlers along with some allied Creek peoples. General Andrew Jackson was designated with the task of putting down this rebellion and was sent in with U.S. reinforcements. He defeated the Red Sticks, and his forces burned Creek villages after the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. In the Treaty of Fort Jackson, the U.S. acquired title to 23 million acres, territory that includes most of present-day Alabama and a large swath of southern Georgia. It is during this time period also that Andrew Jackson begins to really gain his reputation as an Indian fighter, or as some scholars refer to Jackson, perpetrator of genocide. This brings to a close our look at materials and topics from week 11 in History 3190.